Years ago, and this, let's see.
Dredging up the facts now.
And I asked Dominic, can you tell me something about yourself so I can tell people? So I'm going to read it, what he sent me. I broke my back spectacularly nearly 25 years ago with the most complete cutting of the spinal cord that the LGH team had seen, so that they could confidently tell him that he'll never walk again. But they hadn't reckoned on the team of Prem and Dom with my outstanding physio Angela. With zero lower body function and zero sensation, I walked the length of the LGH corridor from the second floor to the main entrance. It's possibly one of the most physically intense exercises in his entire life. So never be told you can't. That's Dominic. And I'll leave the rest of the introduction to Dominic. Dominic is 100% energy. You will be energized once you has a word in your ears. The other person I want to, our next guest is Christine Bergman over there. Christine is from Launceston. She's married with 5 children and 6 grandchildren. She runs her own bookkeeping business, and busyness is her thing. One of her many passions is playing competition 8-ball, on which she has been a participant in the past 6 years at the National Women's 8-ball team for Tasmania. She's also loves playing snooker. So she is going to give us the demonstration game, and feel free to have a hit with her, okay? I'm sure she won't put you down. All right, I'll hand over the time now to Dominic, who will be speaking to us for about 20 minutes and telling us his story.
Thank you. Well, I don't know about telling my story. There's far too many, but the one I actually wanted to talk about, as Prem's alluded to, was probably my first big project and maybe the most inspiring for my subsequent lifestyle. And it was the case. I woke up in the LGH after having fallen off a cliff in the Cataract Gorge in Launceston, and they'd done numerous scans, MRI, CT and X-ray, and they said yes, it was just about the most complete cut of the spinal cord they'd ever seen. My T12 vertebra on impact from a 30-metre fall just exploded, and they're notorious for doing that, being hollow, and the shards just literally obliterated the entire spinal cord. And they said to me that night, which was, most people say that's a bit harsh, but in actual fact, for some weird reason, I didn't perceive it as such. Maybe it's because I was high as a kite on morphine, I don't know. Well, I wouldn't say high, because I actually had an allergy to it. I got terrible nightmares. But at the instance, yes, it seems quite reasonable that they should say, well, you'll never walk or run again. But what they didn't say was everything else that I would be able to do. So, yeah, that was 25 years ago, and although I'm pretty long in the tooth, years prior to that, I consider myself and behave probably like a 25-year-old, because as far as I'm concerned, if you're stuck in one of these things, you might as well have some fun. But I can assure you, and although I feel like very much an imposter today, because I gather for most of our guests you have amputation of sort or lost limbs, and at the time with my legs being completely vestigial, i.e. useless, and I have no idea where they are or what they're up to, I'd said to them at the get-go, please cut them off, you know, because they're just going to get in the way. And as illustrated, when they decided as a treat for all the people going through rehab, and with spinal rehabilitation, in those days, I think still today, we had to go over to Melbourne. Acute surgery was done in the Royal Austin, and as such was a nightmarish notion for any patients, you know, heading back there for subsequent complications. And then the actual rehab was in the Talbot Hospital, which is quite a new hospital. Well, that was, to my mind, absolute paradise, because the floors were just like schmick vinyl, and you could just fly around in the chair. So I got off to a great start. I wasn't very popular. And there's too many stories to tell you about that part of the rehab, but I want to jump maybe about a year or so later, when I don't know actually who conjured up the idea of well, you know, he's absolutely physically fit as a fiddle and is crazy as, let's see if, you know, we can put orthotics on his lower body. And they were called KFOs. And to describe them as monstrous is appalling, because actually Prem put some lovely colours striated throughout the plastic carapace, his lower leg and thighs. So I looked quite jolly, but that's not how I felt in them. It was an extreme exercise. But as KFOs, they effectively enclosed the entire lower body, all leg, and they had a really fancy, I mean, it was so cutting edge in that day. They had a hinge at the top through which you might be able to sort of like rotate your hips to swing your legs, given that zero muscles for me, okay? And that hinge alone was worth $1,000. And Prem always said, you know, if you ever give this away, make sure that hinge comes back to the department, because it really was worth a hell of a lot. Let alone the hinges that, you know, like straighten the legs. And that was a feat in its own right. Excuse the pun, that's terrible. I've always borrowed a pun. Just because when you don't have usage of your body, as some of you all know, you know, you can get contracture, and it's very, very hard to try and head that off. So just straightening the legs was a real chore. But for poor Angela, as Prem has alluded to, the physio, well, I was a nightmare, I'm sure. She maintained I stood 6'4". We got off on the wrong, I'm not going to say wrong foot, we got off on the wrong tangent from the get-go. Because I said emphatically, well, no, I was 6'1.5". Sorry, I'd speak imperial because I was a POM. I've always done sport for Australia, by the way, just in case you're doubting. I love beating the POMs. Nothing more exciting than thrashing the POMs. But I digress. So, yeah, Angela said 6'4", and I said, no, 6'1.5". And poor old Prem had to make up the difference in building the KFOs. But they did fit, whatever height I was. But of course, the higher I was, the more teetering and tottering I was going to be. And Angela could say with confidence, because she said her husband was 6'4", so, you know, there you go. So that was interesting just from the get-go. Being a scientist, I thought, wow, I've actually grown 1.5 inches, even though, yeah, it's sort of useless. In fact, counterproductive, particularly with this walking program that we had. And that's just an example of the fact that when you don't get to use your body, things just sort of like expand. Ligaments, tendons, the joints themselves become a bit sloppy and loose. And in particular, in the vertebral column, you know, you've got all those joints and they all just like loosen up and everything like that. And so that accounted for this increase in height. Well, it was an absolute nightmare, because what we hadn't ever ascertained was when I'd had my surgery and they'd had to fuse quite a length of the lower back, and they'd put in a couple of rods, Harrington rods, which I got removed because they were horrible. You could feel them. You could feel this metal rod sticking out your back. It was revolting, but that's another story. And I had to actually obviously be upright to walk, but my back had somehow or other with my pelvis, and they would never confirm or otherwise, but I mean, we had the evidence that I was fused, this being the torso and this being the legs, I like that angle. So I don't know if you can imagine, like, well, how the hell would you balance at that angle? Now, if you had all the muscles, good abs and everything like that, you know, maybe you could. It'd be a bit uncomfortable walking around like that. Of course, if you had some crutches, that would be a big help. But if you have like literally no muscle groups below the level of lesion, for me, which is like, call it the waist, you can imagine all you're going to do is like buckle like this the whole time when you're trying to walk, you know, like that direction. Then the only way around it was literally with, you know, really good pair of crutches with the cuffs on the arms and everything like that, was to support the entire body. Well, don't know where you got this idea from that I was ever going to be able to walk, but to support the entire body weight through the shoulders and arms like this, tottering at 6'4", no sensation, didn't matter, you know, it felt like I was intoxicated for the bizarre out-of-body experience that it was. But yeah, after months and months and months, literally, we managed to get, it wasn't ever what we call a functional gait, but it was very much a therapeutic walk. And yeah, those surgeons and those doctors who said that night I'd never walk again, well, the smile on the security guard who recognised me from all the evenings that I used to nick out because I was bored as, waiting 5 weeks, finishing in the LGH, had a huge grin on his face to see me go out. So that was the first project, and I don't suppose I ever really comprehended, I'm sure Prem didn't, as to where it would lead. And I don't know if you've heard anything about me. I'm probably a bit out of the limelight with the sports I chose, or they chose me, I should say. But yeah, after all these 25 years, I've been to 2 Paralympics. I've competed as a rower in the Beijing Games in 2008, in summer, as they call it. And then they got me earmarked because they reckon I was an absolute twerp and would just exercise like crazy given a regime. And they got me to go to the Vancouver Games, and unfortunately Australia's only sit skier, cross-country skier, ever to compete for Australia. And I did that like about a year and a half, 2 years later. And I think there's only 7 people actually in Australia that's ever done a winter and summer. And at the moment, I'm not even going to tell you what they're up to, but they're grooming me for another one, I think. So yeah, no drinks for me today, but have I waffled enough?
No, you can carry on a bit.
Okay. But that's sort of currently where I am. But when I look back on it, I realised that first project, which just seems so insurmountable, actually sort of like cemented something in my head. Well, yeah, don't ever tell me, you know, I can't do something. And in actual fact, after one presentation to the Australian rowing team in the World Championships in Germany, the head coach came up to me and he sort of said, so essentially really, it's just like if someone says you can't do something, you try and go out and do it. And I mean, I've got no extra positivity or capability than anyone else here. I think it's just a mindset. But if you can get this guy over here to make me gadgets that facilitate a more exciting or varied type of life, then I would highly recommend Prem.
Well, I tried. I had a great relationship with Dominic, and you know, he's just 100% energy. It's been 25 years. You know, I still remember, you know, the sweat that poured down his face and his arms, you know, as he walked out of that hospital. For me at the time, Dominic just had to walk out. Nothing was going to stop him. And I remember that day that we shared together, and it was awesome. And Dominic's involved with Balfour Burn and anything sporty, Dominic's there. So a really good person for young people and that you inspire, and us as well, Dominic. Awesome, thanks.
So do you have prostheses? I can't see what is under your jeans.
No, well actually the skinniest legs that any lass could crave. Look at that.
So
it's just a femur. It's appalling.
So you have your own legs?
I have my own legs,
You
yes.
have your own legs?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But they really, honest to goodness, you know, I wake up in the morning, where are my legs? They're hanging out of bed. They're frozen, they're knotted. I mean, what I did, I was going to tell you a little snippet. When we were in rehab, they took us to the main gymnasium to see some interstate teams having a bit of a competition, wheelchair basketball. And they were warming up, and one of these people in a basketball wheelchair was flinging it, excuse my French, this is my word I've come up with, for like hurtling around in a wheelchair. It's that or hooning, and hooning's got a bad synonymous relationship with things on the road. But anyway, so this particular athlete was tearing down the back of the court, and all of a sudden everyone was aghast because one of their feet had sort of vibrated off the footplate and got caught upside down underneath the footplate, between the footplate and the wheel, and hadn't had any sensation of it. And we just thought, oh, it's got to be like so, well, not painful because they couldn't feel it, but that's got to be so, you know, catastrophic. But the irony is that in the absence of having any use, everything becomes so loose and flexible that no damage was done at all. But it is a nightmare not being able to feel them. Oh, can I not be heard? Oh, is it on? Can everyone hear me now? I'm sure I was going to finish.
Start again.
Start again. Well, if you've got, ask me questions because there's lots of hilarious stories. I'll agree to that. But
Well, we'll just take one question from the floor, or 2 questions.
Anybody got any questions? One of the things that interests me is that there's you're quadriplegic.
No, paraplegic.
Paraplegic,
yes.
sorry. Yeah. You're living in Tasmania, bloody cold joint. How do you maintain and monitor body temperature? Do you have any problems with it?
Well, I do, and that's one reason why I'm actually wearing a singlet, because I've got no temperature regulation for well over half my body. In fact, from the level of lesion, yeah, no temperature control, but no sweat control as well. Not that it's an excuse for how I behaved when I was walking out of the hospital drenched in sweat, because that was my upper body. And it does make it very, very difficult. Before my accident, I used to do loads of bushwalking and mountaineering around the state. And I was always very appreciative, you know, when you're walking through the amazing countryside of Tasmania, how exerting it can be. And, you know, your temperature go up and down depending on whether you're clambering over boulders or going down a ravine. And, you know, taking a top on and off, several layers. And I've still persisted with like that approach to this day because I've got that total lack of inability. I mean, it's such a huge surface area, the legs, and not to have any temperature regulation is a nightmare. But in addition, I mean, I'm sure, unfortunately for a lot of you, you suffer from phantom limb pain. Is that the case? Or you're all, some nods, yeah. Now I don't obviously have that because I've got my limbs, but flipping oath, they hurt, and they hurt the whole time. So I'm in constant pain from the waist down, and temperature is a really, really strong aggravator, in particular for this right leg. And if it gets cold, it just hurts like crazy. But then again, a lot of people get arthritis and things like that in their old age, so I can't complain really. Just put up with it.
How have you managed the pain?
Well, I take 0 drugs, believe it or not. I try and just keep on top of it, literally by sort of strength of mind / distraction. Probably why I train so hard, because when I'm training, I very rarely feel my otherwise constant background pain. But that is very, very draining to try and do it all in the mind. But I alluded to the fact I was a scientist, and I'm now sort of like a retired scientist, but I'm putting back in the education department, sharing my passion of science at Hobart College of all places. I digress. Oh yes, so it is very, very tiring mentally, but if I keep myself, you know, like occupied, so my work, it's always been a good distraction, and certainly all my physical exercise. But it's not necessarily, with a lot of the stories you might hear, if you tackle me after this presentation, I can't claim, although I'm a scientist, I can't claim to be, like a medical scientist. So you'll have to just presume what I'm saying is, how it pertains to me, and that's what I do. But it's a very delicate balancing act, because I always remember them saying, well, look, if you're going to go down that track, you've got to be really careful, because with pain, your body can just be overwhelmed with it eventually, and you get this horrific, almost cataclysmic leap, where the pain scale, instead of being 1 to 10, jumps from 1 to 100. So it's like, if you ever have become sensitized to something, I don't know whether it's just, can you relate to the scratching of fingernails down an old-fashioned blackboard, and put you on edge, when in fact there's absolutely no stimulus to yourself that makes you feel so. But similarly with any body pain, it can go into what they then a chronic type of scale, and then you're in serious trouble.
Can you describe
The prosthesis.
What's the question?
Can you describe the device you use one more time?
Oh, for the walking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they were called KFOs.
It's called a walkabout. That was what it was called.
A walkabout. There we go. Okay. I never got out back with it, but anyway, how the front LGH was good enough for me. Right, so literally, Prem had to do an entire plaster cast of my lower body, which was quite weird, to say the least, particularly when you don't have any sensation. And then once that had set and was cut away, he was able to literally fabricate through, it was almost like a kayak building exercise with resin and like, was it fiberglass? It wasn't fiberglass,
Plastic
but
largely.
yeah. But essentially build up, I call it a carapace, so it's like a shell, like an insect exoskeleton, but obviously a lot thicker and firmer than that. And it's a good question because you couldn't, without any leg movement, actually it's hilarious just trying to put shoes on when you can't feel your toes. You can rip your toenail off, it's that sad, you know. You've got to really make sure they're loose and all that sort of, and be very, very careful. And with the carapace, it was a total nightmare because entire length of your upper body and lower body, the lower limb needed to slide through. The carapace wasn't a complete tube. It actually had an open either frontis or at the back. So you had a little bit of wriggle room. But essentially you had to wriggle the foot and lower calf and lower leg down into the lower section. So that had like a foot shell in which the foot would be placed, and you had to have a good sock because again you couldn't feel anything, and pressure is, you may know, in the absence of limbs can cause like a huge problem because your weight isn't otherwise distributed, or you get an extreme amount of weight through a prosthetic. And so the foot had to be very carefully placed in the base. They get the lower leg in, and then you had to try and get the thigh lower the thigh into the upper section, and then straps over the top so as to pull the carapace around. And then finally, with the lower and upper leg strapped, you then needed to straighten it, and that was a lot of work that Angela had to do to just continually keep the leg flexible, because all it wanted to do was, well, you can imagine if you sat all day long, and that's what I do, I just sit around all day long, that your leg just becomes, you know, like, wants to stay like that. So, yeah, I don't know if that description conjures up a horrific image of the torturous contraption. No, it was brilliant.
All right, thank you, Dominic, so much for sharing your story.